for joining us in today's Fireside Chat. And this is testing times for a big part of the world, and I think this is a very important topic that we're touching upon today. So I hope that we'll be able to engage our audience at the end of the session here. Today's topic is the impact of the Iran war on US and India, a timely and complex issue that touches on global geopolitics, energy security, economic stability, and strategic relations in an increasing interconnected world. We're delighted to have with us Dr. K.V. Bapa Rao, IIT Madras class of 1978, a seasoned computer scientist, former faculty at the University of Southern California, and a keen commentator on global affairs. With decades of experience across technology, academia, and public discourse, he brings a unique perspective to this discussion here today. In conversation with him is our very own EC member, Mr. Rajiv Srinivasan, also from the batch of 1978, currently an adjunct faculty at IIM Bangalore, known for his insightful views on technology, economics, and policy. So let's get started on this topic. Thank you again, everybody. And over to you, Rajiv and Dr. Rao.
Thank you, Nishani. Great to be here. And I'm really delighted to have as my guest my old friend and classmate, Bapa Rao. His full name is Bapa Rao Kochurlakota, but he goes by Bapa. And he and I have spent some time in the past talking about Indian related affairs, especially when I was in the US. We used to occasionally write together in a magazine called India Currents in San Francisco. And Bapa Rao has also written for Outlook India about India related issues. And we also had for a while in the 1990s a radio program where we used to talk about India-related affairs. So this is on KPFA, a radio station in Berkeley, California. So it's a pleasure to invite somebody who's got two perspectives. One is the Indian perspective, and the other is the American perspective. So without further ado, let me just jump into the program. And the way we're going to conduct this is as follows. For the first 5 minutes, I'm going to ask Bapa Rao to do a monologue where he lays out his essential thesis about where the Iran war is going. And then we'll have about 45 minutes of a conversation where I'm going to ask him a few questions based on his initial overview, his opening statement. And that should go for another maybe 45 minutes. That leaves us with about 10 to 15 minutes of questions. And the questions are from the audience. And I request you guys in the audience two things from you. One is please make sure you're muted, because otherwise it gets to be a little bit disruptive if we hear audio from you guys. So your audio should be muted. And the second is whatever questions you have, if you look at the bottom of the screen, there is a space where it says chat. Okay? So go to that chat box and enter your questions, please. And what we'll do is, after we finish our conversation, we will pick up, and I will specifically pick up a few questions from you and ask Bapa to respond to them. Okay, I hope that mechanism is clear. So we will not have questions during the conversation, but at the end, and we'll take as many questions as are possible for us to fit into our schedule here. So without further ado, and I hope this mechanism is clear, let me just request Dr. Bapa Rao to go ahead and speak for a few minutes. Bapa, all yours.
Okay, just a moment, and I'm going to. Yeah, just give me a second to get set up here.
Okay.
Yeah.
As I was saying, we were classmates at IIT Madras, also the hostel mates. So it's a great pleasure for me to have him on board. Go ahead.
Okay, I'm ready to go. Okay, good morning, good evening, everyone, and thank you, Rajiv, Nishani, Papia, Sandhya, and all the alumni team for putting this together. So it's a great privilege for me to be here with my fellow alumni to discuss something that's as consequential as it is confusing. Let me start with a blunt observation. In a war like this, almost everything you hear is either incomplete, biased, or wrong. There's an old Hollywood line, which I like: nobody knows anything. In geopolitics, I would upgrade that to nobody knows anything and everybody pretends that they do. What we're seeing today isn't just a military conflict, it's an information war layered on top of it. Governments spin, media amplifies selectively, and social media distorts. And then there's a third layer. People project their personal beliefs and emotions, often dressed up as analysis. Now, interestingly, this varies a lot by country and by demographic. What feels all consuming in one media environment is barely registering in another. The result is a lot of noise and very little signal. So, instead of trying to know everything, I find it more useful to apply a couple of filters. First, think in terms of what doesn't change versus what does. Not every headline matters equally. Some forces are deep and persistent, others are just surface turbulence. Second, be deliberately skeptical. It's a simple test. If a source is clearly wrong about something that you understand well, say India, assume they're likely cutting corners elsewhere too. But importantly, don't give extra credit just because they agree with you. Agreement is not accuracy. So now stepping back, what are the deeper forces at play here? This conflict is not about a single trigger or a single event. It's sitting on top of multiple fault lines. There are long-standing identity and civilizational tensions in the region, including the centrality of Israel in regional politics and global alignments. Then there's the strategic importance of the Persian Gulf, which is arguably the most critical energy corridor in the world. There's the global financial system, especially the role of the US dollar. And then there's Iran's own sense of history and ambition. Iran wants to shape the region, not just survive in it, and it uses unconventional and distributed instruments of power. Some of these are essentially permanent. Identity-driven conflicts don't get resolved. At best, they get managed. They outlast governments, wars, and even generations. But the global order around them is not permanent. For decades, the stability of the Gulf and hence global trade and energy has rested on American power. Not just actual military force, but the credible threat of it. That stability has benefited not just the US and the West, but also countries across Asia, such as Japan, South Korea, countries of Southeast Asia, China, and increasingly India. Now here's the uncomfortable question. What if that stabilizing force weakens? This war could be one of those moments where the system starts to shift. Maybe the US remains dominant, but less decisive. Maybe other powers, like for example China, step in more assertively. Or maybe we move into a genuinely multipolar world where stability is negotiated rather than enforced. In such a world, middle powers, potentially including India, have a larger diplomatic role. None of these scenarios is clean. All of them come with friction. Which brings me to the economic angle. So far, markets are reacting in a relatively measured way. Most of the concerns have been around oil, supply chains, and inflation expectations. But that's the early phase. The bigger risks are second-order effects. If geopolitical stability weakens, you don't just get higher prices, you get uncertainty baked into the system. And that uncertainty can show up very concretely in energy availability, in critical industrial inputs, and in the viability of trade corridors and agreements. And uncertainty is expensive. It slows investment, distorts trade, and eventually hits growth. For the US, there's an even deeper risk. Its economic strength is tied not just to productivity, but to the central role of the dollar. If that comes under sustained pressure, the consequences will be felt on the ground as real hardship, especially for the middle and lower segments of society. For India, the picture is mixed. In the short term, India feels the pain directly. Energy costs are rising, supplies are being disrupted, leading to pressure on key sectors. That's unavoidable. But in relative terms, India may actually be able to cope better than it might appear. India has experience dealing with constraints, a diversified economic base, and institutional mechanisms for supporting vulnerable populations. These mechanisms could be better, but they still manage to deliver. At the same time, India is navigating a more complex strategic landscape, having to balance deepening ties with partners like Israel, and at the same time, maintaining flexibility in a rapidly shifting geopolitical environment. And like many countries, India also has to think about how the nature of conflict itself is evolving. Drones, cyber tools, and data and AI driven systems are all playing big roles now. What this means for India's own national security is a big question. In other words, this is not comfortable territory, but it's not unfamiliar territory either. So let me end on this note. It's tempting to look for clean narratives, good versus bad, what's going to happen, right versus wrong, inevitable versus avoidable. But reality is messier. This is a system under stress, with multiple actors pursuing their own interests, often at cross purposes. I like to say non-linear multivariate system. So for those of you who still remember what we studied at IIT, I've kept this all fairly high level, and hopefully in the discussion we can get into some of the specifics that I kind of touched on, or maybe not touched on at all, and explore them in more detail. So I'll stop here, and looking forward to the questions and maybe disputes, disagreements that follow. Thank you.
All right. Thank you for that very erudite opening statement. And one of the things you mentioned was the response to this war. If I quote you, it says it varies by country and demographic. So, since you're on the ground in the US, from a perspective of somebody in the US,
Mhm.
what is the impact of the Iran war? Are Americans really obsessing over it, or largely indifferent, or are they even able to locate Iran on a map? Especially, especially now that an Iranian missile landed in Diego Garcia, I
Mhm,
think
mhm.
it's not it's a reasonable question to ask you. Are people paying attention?
Yes, people are paying attention, but I think the quality of attention is a little different from what those from India side might imagine. So it's not a dominating topic of conversation for everyday folks. Most people are focused on domestic issues unless it impacts them directly. For instance, uh, gasoline prices have gone up by about almost 15 to 20%. So everybody's noticing that. And then I think if there are uh, dead American soldiers coming home, there's going to be more attention. And generally, there's a deeper pattern. The US is a country that engages deeply at the policy level, but at the public level, the engagement is kind of uneven. So there's a little bit of a disconnect there. Decisions with are made that have global consequences, but the actual degree of public scrutiny is limited. So I'll say this, in the wonkish policy and political circles, there's definitely a lot of attention paid and headlines and opinion pieces and debates that are going on, very partisan, often vituperative about the merits of getting into this war. And one topic has been the place of what are thought of as Jewish interests in American policy making. So yeah, so there is, to sum up, there is a lot of debate, there is attention, but not so much for the common folks. And I think the common American person on the street doesn't really care where exactly Iran is. It doesn't really affect them one way or the other because they're not the ones making the decision.
Well, the situation a little bit different in India, I'd say, because it is the topic of conversation here, and
Sure.
cooking gas shortages and restaurants are
Yeah,
shutting down and so on. And it's pretty close to us, right? And Indian ships are traversing the
absolutely.
Straits of Hormuz, etc. So it's definitely a major topic here, and it probably has more consequences for India. But to take that one step further, is there an end game? I had thought that this whole thing would blow over in maybe 3 or 4 days, maybe a week tops. Now it's more than 3 weeks, getting on
Right.
almost a month. So what do you think? Is it going to continue for an
Uh,
indefinite period of time, or are people looking for an off ramp, as they say, a way in which people can save face and exit? And if that is the case, do you think India has a role as I don't know, a reasonably well-intentioned broker, middleman, who has fairly decent relationships with all the parties involved?
mhm.
What do you think?
Well, we all want this to be over right now. This is not good for anyone. As you said, India is getting hit pretty badly in terms of hardships right now. But in general, an off ramp really depends on whether the major players in the war see more risk in continuing than in stopping. And it's not entirely obvious that this issue has been resolved at this point, though I must say that the US administration is pretty sensitive to the impact on the markets, and Iran knows that. Now, just how sensitive? Uh, you know, I think Iran is guessing, and maybe the US itself doesn't quite know at this point. They have to respond to different signals from the political and financial world. Uh, but the costs and risks to the US and beyond the US, unilaterally declaring the end of the war, end to the war, they're very high if US just steps away. And including maybe Iran deciding to exit the non-proliferation treaty and becoming a nuclear power as North Korea did. So I think the US's tolerance for market disruption may be higher than Iran believes it to be. So I'm afraid it's going to go on somewhat longer than we wanted to. But there is a big challenge for the U.S. administration as far as achieving some sort of domestic political consensus on absorbing pain. So I guess I'm just going to waffle and say, uh, you know, I don't know. as for, so the second part of your question about mediation and India's role, I think on paper India is set very nicely, like right in the middle, sort of an Ajata Shatru who really has no enemies among any of the
Belligerent.
main actors here. Yeah. So, India could play a role, but I don't think as a primary broker. So, what we have here are actors with very deep stakes and very low trust. They, just simply have very high suspicions of each other. So external mediation, works best when both sides want to have an exit, and they're both tired of fighting. So India's strength is more in terms of a credible, non-threatening back-channel interlocutor who can help lower the temperature for a time. For example, for humanitarian purposes, maybe evacuating the wounded or something like that. Uh, India has neither shown any interest in being a formal broker, nor does India have any real institutional experience in this domain. Unlike, say, a country like Norway or even a tiny place like Oman. So there you have it.
Okay, so you don't believe that India should be in the middle of making this war go away. But to take that one step further, you know, in the various ripple effects that we're seeing now from the war, which are broad, right? It's, as you mentioned, it hurts the financial markets,
Yep.
etc. And where do you think people will be hurt the most? And is there anybody who's benefiting? Because at some point, I think that, I'm inclined to think that everybody is hurting from this war. And
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
so, in global as well as specifically in the US and India, who's benefiting, who's losing?
Okay. Yeah. So before we even talk about it in more broad or abstract terms, we should recognize at the outset that humans on both sides of the war are hurting a lot physically, as in being killed, maimed, and dislocated from their homes. Also true for those in bystander countries around the war zone, like some of the the Gulf Arab countries, and also countries a little farther out, like India. And I think it helps to see this hurt as the baseline for all the hurt experienced by those that are more distant from the scene. So, as a general rule, I'll say that war brings no assured benefits to anyone. Even when the combatants are clear about the desired outcomes of the war, once a war starts, the outcomes are uncertain.
Right.
Jayapajayani daivadhinam, as we say in Sanskrit. There are unintended consequences, and the costs are too high all around. In complex system level conflicts like this, almost everyone loses, but perhaps not all at the same time and not to the same degree. Some actors may benefit in the short term tactically, higher energy prices, defense contracts. Somebody is making that money. But strategically, it makes the system less predictable, and that hurts long term growth everywhere. For the US, it's going to see further pressure on the dollar's primacy, with at least temporarily depleted military having an amplifying effect on that. So the dollar is in prime position because everybody is afraid of the US military. But if the US uses up all its munitions and has a setback militarily, then that's going to make people less compelled to trust in the dollar. So this will probably have deep and probably lasting negative effects on the US economy. As I hinted in my statement, wealth and growth overall are going to decline. For India, India is going to face short-term pain, and it may even lose a point or two in its growth rate for the time being. But the long-term growth projections, I think, in the first place, they would necessarily have to account for disruptive events like this. There's no point in having growth projections over the long term which rely on the entire world being stable the whole time. That's not realistic. So, what I would say is India's mettle will be tested. So whether that translates to long term hurt or strengthening, as Nietzsche said, the thing that doesn't kill me is going to make me stronger. That's the question. So I feel fairly confident in saying that the growth rates for India may change, but the fact of India's growth itself will be a constant.
Okay, that's a positive view. I agree with you that India is going to take a short-term hit, but probably the long-term, the so-called long India, right? A positive
Yeah,
over time is still there. But let
yeah.
me go back to something else that you said in your monologue. You said there were a lot of questions about the so-called Jewish interest in
Hmm.
American
Yeah.
partisan politics. But India has also been, deepening its ties with Israel. Like, for example, Prime Minister Modi visited
Hmm.
Israel just before the war. And is that helping it or hurting it? I mean, India, in the context of this war,
Hmm.
these, I don't know, uh, these links to Israel, because
Yeah.
so there are also military links there. Is that
Sure.
helpful or hurtful?
Okay, so for especially for this question, I'd like to go back to my concept of things that are constant versus things that change for a time being but don't affect the constants. So India's ties with Israel have to do with defense and general technology, outsourcing of Israeli manufacturing to India, and things like that. India wants a boost in technology, and Israel wants a place to expand its manufacturing base. So, objectively, this war changes nothing in terms of what India and Israel hope to get from the relationship. So, that's a constant. On the other hand, it's not as though India will get significantly more benefits from, let's say, Iran if India abandons Israel at this time. There are internal power dynamics in India, as everybody knows, that have the potential to cause disruption because of the war and the ties with Israel. So that's an added risk to be managed. So, to sum up, this relationship is a constant, but it's subject to India's internal political currents.
Okay, so you're basically saying that India has a national interest in
Yeah,
being reasonably friendly with Israel, and that may or may not have a big impact on the war or India's ability to broker a peace agreement. But let me move on to another topic in general. See,
yeah.
I'm kind of convinced that the relative, what should I say, maybe impotence of the
Hmm.
U.S.-Israeli war machine against
Mm.
Iran. I mean, that's a strong term that I'm using.
Yeah.
But
Mm.
they have complete air superiority.
Hmm.
Okay, they've got F-35s and B-2 bombers and whatnot
Yeah.
up there. But
Hmm.
Iran, with a bunch of low-cost, $20,000
Yeah.
drones
Yeah.
and some missiles, and
Yeah.
maybe even psychological warfare, cyber warfare, etc.
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
Okay, is fending this major assault off. It's fending it off. What does this
Yeah.
mean for India? And is this a step change in warfare altogether
Hmm.
that
Hmm.
aircraft carriers and fighter jets don't matter so much anymore? What do you think?
Well, yeah. So new this new revolution in military affairs, if it's not quite a step change, it's definitely a very steep, accelerated change from drone warfare in the Azerbaijan-Armenia war that I think was some 5 years ago to the Ukraine war and now the Iran war. We're seeing a huge role for cheap, mass-produced drones that even the odds significantly for smaller powers like Iran or Ukraine. Well, interestingly, it turns out that being corrupt, economically and socially stressed, and engaged in a war is no obstacle to building up a formidable and resilient manufacturing base for cheap but effective military drones, both in the case of Ukraine and Iran. And just as an aside, uh, can you name a corrupt and economically and socially stressed country just to the west of India? It starts
Just
with a P.
starts with a P, I thought. Okay.
Starts with a P.
P, I got that. Okay.
Yeah, yeah. So it definitely, this is definitely going to impact India. That's that. So what's changing is not just technology, but it's accessibility, capabilities that only major powers used to have. We both remember as recently as 10 to 12 years ago, uh, the US was the undisputed king of drones. They're all over the region and, blowing away people on the ground, and, it was amazing. Well, now, small states and even non state actors can get hold of drones. So there's a barrier to entry which is lowered for conflict. And even as we speak, we've seen the introduction of drones into northeastern India by
Yes.
foreign
Yes.
mercenaries. And clearly there are implications that not just for external warfare but also internal security. This creates a world where deterrence becomes harder because more actors can impose costs on established countries which have a lot to lose without exposing themselves fully. So, looking at the psychological front, where human brains are being intentionally reprogrammed with false or biased information and at scale. Now that presents its own challenges to India. AI plays a huge role in this. I'll give you an example. So recall when Modi spoke in Israel's parliament, he said that Indian Jews who emigrated to Israel have told him that India is their motherland while Israel is their fatherland. Now, it was reported in India and, in fact, all over the global media as Modi saying that he himself considers Israel to be his fatherland. Now, in preparing for this chat, I was fiddling around with some of the AI apps, and I discovered that AI is actually trained to think of this distortion as a fact.
Okay.
So, India's challenges. I want to come back to my concept of constants and variables. India's challenges and the resolve of its major adversaries are constants. The means by which those challenges are expressed, those are variables. They're changing with the times. So India has to now deal with drones, cyber tools, AI, big data, cyber, and so forth.
There's a big narrative war out there, sort of in parallel
Yep,
to the real physical war, isn't there? And India
absolutely.
is pretty bad at dealing with it. But another question that has come up is, we're seeing how Iran
Hmm.
probably has figured out a way to survive the decapitation strike. Because
Hmm.
most of us would have thought that if the entire top management, the top leadership, not even the top layer, but the first, second, and third layers have all
Hmm.
been decimated. They continue to be decimated, but they're surviving. And how is that happening? They apparently have a distributed mechanism, and
Yeah.
distributed systems we all know are more resilient to challenges. But what is your forecast for how far Iran can continue to survive?
Well, I mean, we both have the same data and sources of information, and from all that I can see, Iran's distributed system strategy seems to be working, fairly well for it. Now, of course, they don't have an infinite number of command and control nodes. They have to be exhausted at some point. But it's a question of can the war continue at that level for that long to eliminate all the nodes that are there. But as long as there are nodes there, it seems they seem to be working in a distributed fashion. It's almost like Iran took a page out of the original ARPANET design, which was intentionally uh, created to be resilient in the face of the decapitating nuclear strike, to continue to operate. You lose nodes, but the overall system and network will continue to work. So and this seems very well suited right now for the kind of war that the Iranian system is fighting. It's what I would call a defensive offensive war, in which anything goes for hitting the enemy, and widening the conflict far from raising concerns. It's actually the strategy. This use case is ideally suited for a distributed system. The commanders don't need permission from above to take
Right.
aggressive decisions, and everyone is more or less on the same page about policy matters. Just survive and keep going, right? That's the policy. Hit regional US interests as hard as you can, and by the way, crush any internal opposition around you. Very simple and very relatively straightforward to implement. So this model is not just resilient, it's almost what you might call anti-fragile. So the pressure doesn't necessarily weaken it, it might almost reinforce some of these network properties and behaviors.
That's
So
an
there's no
interesting
point of training.
comparison. Sorry, I didn't
Yeah,
mean
go
to
ahead.
interrupt you.
Yeah, I'm done. I just want to say that, like from the Iranian perspective, they want their system to remain constant for all practical purposes, while the Americans and Israelis are trying to turn this into a variable. So I'm kind of hung up on my constant
Right.
and variable theory here.
Yeah, it's an interesting comparison you made with the ARPANET because you
Yeah,
delete a bunch of nodes, but there are still other ways you can get around the network. And that has very interesting properties of resilience. And anti-fragile is something that was popularized by Nassim Taleb,
yeah,
right? It's a
yeah,
very
yeah.
interesting concept.
Who is in fact from that area?
He's
right?
from Lebanon, right?
Yeah, yeah,
So, from your point of view, and I generally agree with you, I don't think Iran is going to collapse anytime soon. I didn't think they would, and
right, right.
that's what's going on. But on
Yeah,
the
yeah.
other
If they're
hand,
going to, yeah, yeah, if they're going to collapse, they would have done it, a week or two ago.
right, right, because
Yeah.
I think the idea was that once you do a decapitation strike, then the next step would be a color revolution where the populace rises up against the
Yep,
current
yep,
rulers. It did not happen. I didn't anticipate that it would happen, partly because,
yep,
in my
yep.
opinion, yes, the Iranians may not like the mullahs so much, but they don't like the Americans at all. And they remember Mossadegh and they remember the Shah of Iran and whatnot. Anyway, but going back to India and its issues, see, we're now seeing almost a complete shutdown in oil, gas, maybe sulfuric acid, helium, and other things because of the closure of the Straits of Hormuz. And India has been doing a bunch of bilateral trade agreements and free trade agreements and so on recently. But even with all that, isn't this a huge single point of failure for India that just the closure of this strait is hurting not only imports, and in many ways, you mentioned
Yeah.
food and agricultural production because fertilizer production is going to go down, but also exports. See, India
Yeah.
exports a lot of food,
Yeah.
and I heard somewhere recently that the price of eggs has crashed, the price of basmati rice has crashed because
Yeah.
there's no demand for it. So, how does all this work out?
Well, I mean, it's undeniable that, in the near term, there are all these problems and, which may call into question the viability of trade agreements and all the free trade agreements and so on that uh, gave rise to so much optimism. But again, I think the rationale for entering into those agreements hasn't changed. It remains constant. These agreements were made in the first place because India was seen as a strong and stable and profitable trading partner for the needs of these various parties like Europe, Britain, Australia, and so on. So that doesn't change at all. Okay, so but because of the war, you have to trade things. In order to trade things, you have to make things. So if the inputs for making things are not available, then you're not going to be able to trade them. And even if you manage to make them, you have to transport the things over to the buyer.
Right.
And if the transport channels are disrupted, that will be difficult. But nobody is going to just remain stuck with these same transport channels or same sources of production inputs and so forth. All parties, definitely India is going to find workarounds. Even under Trump's sanctions during last year, India moved fairly rapidly to bypass the trade with US and find other buyers,
Alternative. Yeah.
and so on. So, basmati rice, India has 1.5 billion rice eaters. Okay, if nobody buys it, other Indians are going to buy it. And same thing with eggs. Okay, India has out of 1.5 billion, even if you discount the vegetarians, about 1.2 billion will definitely eat eggs. So let them all just start eating one egg more per week. You know, so I mean, in the U.S., the Egg Council and rice business and so on, they're constantly advertising to make people consume more of their stuff. Indian producers can do the same. So the domestic market itself is going to absorb a lot of the surplus.
But you sound like Marie Antoinette. Let them eat cake. So here you're saying let them eat eggs. I'm just
Let
kidding.
them I know it's available, right? India is producing. Why
This
not?
is true. Yeah. Right. But moving on. So we have had these concepts of Atmanirbhar, self-reliance, etc. Does this suggest that India may not benefit a whole lot from imports and exports. I mean, in other words, from trade, and that India should be focusing more on self-reliance. I mean, it's sort of a throwback to the old days of import substitution. But it also brings up another interesting point, which you and I talked about before, Pax Indica. In fact, we were the first people to actually talk about it at some length. If you look at old internet archives, and then of course,
Yes, yes,
our good friend Shashi Tharoor wrote a book
yes,
about it, so we lost our priority there. But so,
yeah.
what does all this mean? The sort of the complete disruption of trade, okay, and India being a major consuming nation, not an exporting nation.
Yeah,
So, what does it mean for Atmanirbhar? And then please touch
right.
upon Pax Indica, whatever your evolved thoughts are from the time we started talking about it in the 1990s.
Okay, yeah. So you've brought up a topic that's close to my heart. um, so for Atmanirbhar, I think let's take the easy one first, or the less expansive one first.
Right.
So for Atmanirbhar, I think we want to take a somewhat sophisticated, complex approach. Yes, in the beginning, back in the days, you know, just following independence, there was a lot of stress on import substitution, ambassador cars and so forth.
Right.
So I think this next level, uh, let's say this is Atmanirbhar 2.0, which is, yes, import substitution where we can do well, but also trade and a kind of activist approach to continuing to facilitate our trade, import and export trades, instead of just simply shutting ourselves in and you know. And by the way, even that didn't really work, did
It
it?
did. It did.
I mean, India still had to really rely on
Export.
PL
Yeah.
480 grains and
Right.
so on. So it was always a good concept, but maybe it needed to evolve. It started out in a sort of simplistic manner, so this has to evolve. So this new version of Atmanirbhar might be defined as something, creating a system where we continue to be resilient and sustainable and fail safe in terms of our international trade dependencies. So we have the trade dependencies, but we have the wherewithal to manage them even under externally imposed adverse circumstances. And there's a lot of domestic state capacity. So PL 480 is a thing of the past. The Indian government machinery, yes, which needs to be more efficient, we all agree, but it has an established track record of actually keeping the wolf from the door for the most vulnerable sections of society. We really haven't had any significant famine in a long time.
True. True.
Yeah, so that's what I think about Atmanirbhar. Now, let's talk about Pax Indica. Okay, so I want to push this in a pretty expansive direction because I think we, as Indians collectively all over the world, we really think too narrowly and underestimate India's potential. So let me offer a thought experiment. Okay, look at this. You know, set America aside. Look at the two major combatants in the area, Israel and Iran. Okay, so the entire population of Israel is actually less than that of Hyderabad. Iran's population is somewhere between the population of Madhya Pradesh and West Bengal.
Right.
If you take Iran and Israel together, and let's say if India consumes both of them, it's only going to raise India's population by about 6%. So what does that mean? So if you imagine like a radically different future, let's dream, not tomorrow, but maybe over decades, where these deeply opposed regions or countries, they don't necessarily resolve their differences or civilizational level clashes, but somehow find ways to coexist within larger economic and strategic frameworks, facilitated by India. Not unity or uniformity, but some sort of structured coexistence, with the structure being actually offered by India. And these countries, if you go back to Iran and Israel somehow being affiliated with India, they'll still have a role in shaping foreign policy and economic policy, but they'll get a 6% role, okay, because that's how much they count relative to India. And in that kind of a world, India's role could be much larger, not just as a participant, but in a different way, as a platform, a system in which a pluralistic system which is very flexible, which can accommodate diversity without requiring uniformity. Sort of, we can say it's an extensible, federated, multi-protocol switch. To be a little geeky, for this audience. So this is what I mean by a more expansive interpretation of Pax Indica. Not dominance, not hegemony, but the ability to anchor a wider zone of stability through economic gravity, institutional capacity, and political flexibility. Now, is something like a loose federation between adversarial states realistic in the near term? Yeah, obviously not. But as a direction of thinking, it actually forces us to ask, are we as Indians aiming merely to protect themselves from instability, hoping that we don't get too affected? I hope this passes, it's not going to last too long, where's the off ramp? Or are we as global Indians capable of shaping stability beyond India's own borders? Because if India limits itself to being reactive, manage energy prices, securing supply chains, and so on, that's a defensive posture. Okay, that's important, have to do it, but it's a limited posture. The more ambitious question is, can India become a system-shaping power, one that others plug into, even when they don't agree with each other? So
That's a good question
yeah,
because
go ahead. Yeah,
let me. Sorry, I'm interrupting, but
no,
this
no, no.
is very different from Pax Americana, which is
Yeah,
hegemonistic,
yeah,
and Pax Sinica, which the Chinese
mhm,
would like to impose. That's also hegemonistic. Here, you're saying
yes,
something that can be a little bit more egalitarian, okay? And
hmm,
it's particularly interesting because, in my opinion, the 19th century was the
hmm,
century of the Atlantic, because
yeah,
that's what controlled everything. The 20th century was the century of the Pacific. And I would claim that the 21st is the century of the Indian Ocean. And
yeah,
who else but India has the
hmm,
capacity? I mean,
hmm,
it's
hmm,
right there. We're right there in the middle
yeah,
of that whole ocean. And if
yep,
we can if we can manage it and not necessarily control it, but I think it
yeah,
also requires two things. One is significant economic growth.
hmm,
Unless you have the money and the economic clout, nobody's going to pay attention to you. Secondly, you need significant military clout as well.
yeah, yeah,
Sadly enough, you've got
yeah,
to invest in
yeah,
submarines and
hmm, hmm,
nuclear missiles launched from submarines
yeah,
and whatnot, right? So with
hmm,
both those, India could then come up with a slightly different PAX mechanism. Maybe
hmm,
we've been hearing about PAX Silica, okay,
yeah,
which is sort of a
hmm,
more egalitarian thing, and maybe a little
yeah,
bit like what the Japanese used to do with MITI
hmm,
in the
hmm,
old days, right?
yeah,
You kind
yeah,
of set the stage, like you were saying.
hmm,
Other people plug into it. You
yeah,
form the basis. So
yeah,
maybe Pax Indica is something that's
hmm,
not really a pipe dream, and it's
yeah,
uh,
yeah,
plausible in the not too
hmm,
distant
hmm.
future. Okay.
Yeah,
So
Rajiv,
yeah,
I don't know how we're doing on time. If I can
uh,
just take a couple of minutes.
sure. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I would say that Pax Indica would be not just slightly but significantly different from
Hmm.
Pax America or Pax Sinica. And I'll make another point, which is before the colonial era, before the 1600s, in fact, the global center of trade for centuries was the Indian Ocean,
Yeah.
and India was a major player in that. And it for all intents and purposes, functioned as what I said earlier, as a kind of multi-protocol federated extensible switch mechanism. So yeah, I know that you probably need time for questions from the audience. So
Yeah, we'll do that. But
yeah, I'll stop
actually,
here. But yeah,
yeah, one of the things that's interesting there is that apparently we used to have these fantastic guilds, trading guilds. We hear about the European guilds, but Sanjeev
yeah,
Sanyal was talking about how temples, especially
yeah,
in southern India, were the venture capitalists and the bankers for these
yeah,
trading guilds. And these guilds have been around for millennia. Because if you
yeah,
remember, there was a complaint from Pliny the Elder in
yeah.
250
Yes,
BC
yes.
or something. He was complaining
Pepper.
that,
Yeah,
yeah, for
pepper.
pepper, they
Yeah, yeah.
were emptying Rome's treasuries of gold.
Yep,
Okay,
yep,
so we've
yep.
had trade is something that India has been doing in the Indian Ocean
Yep,
extremely well for millennia.
yep.
So maybe we can kind of conclude that, see, even though there are clouds on the horizon and there is going to be a lot of short-term disruption, if
Yep.
in India can put together a reasonable basis, okay, in terms of its own stability and anti-fragility and so on, it could
Yeah.
provide a platform for other people to plug in so that we could have a relatively wrinkle-free and stress-free trading paradigm, especially in the Indian
Yeah.
Ocean. So let's hope that that can come true.
Yep.
So,
Yep. Absolutely.
so
And
if you want to give any closing thoughts before I start bringing you the questions from the audience, please go
sure.
ahead.
Yeah. So I just want to say that I like the framework of constants and variables, and for India, I think there is an opportunity here to identify a kind of vision of Parks Indica as a constant and treat all other factors as variables to be adjusted and managed in light of that constant.
Okay.
And we talk about pipe dreams. When you and I were at IIT, what we are doing today and India today would have been a pipe dream, right?
Yes.
You know, I mean, how much has changed since then?
Right.
So it's definitely possible. So something for everyone to think about.
Right. India has actually undergone a kind of a step change, hasn't it? It's no longer
Exactly. Yeah.
sort of a begging bowl country. It's a physically and otherwise noticeably important country. Good. Okay. So let me now ask you some of the questions that have come up. One is
Yeah.
from Gopal, who is the IITMAA secretary. He says, how does this event compare to the other Gulf wars, notably the 1991 and the 2003 war against Iraq? What is your opinion on that?
So yeah, I think the 1991 war and the 2003 wars, they're slightly different animals. The 1991 war is what I would call a kind of police action. Iraq invaded and occupied Kuwait, and the US as a kind of global policeman, got a coalition together, went in and kicked them out. And the 2003 war was a lot less well defined, and many would say, ill conceived and
Yeah.
costly. So this war, I think there are what might be considered valid reasons for the US and Israel to go to war. Iran has been a country that every day its government chants death to America, death to Israel, and they're on the way to making nuclear bombs. Well, at some point something's got to give. You know, is a war the best way to make them stop and change their ways? Who knows? I mean, we can always second guess, but the fact is that the dogs of war have been unleashed, and we have to deal with it.
Okay.
So, yeah, in fact, I think this war, to my mind, has a little bit more of a valid rationale compared to the 2003 war.
However, this is
Yeah.
also much more difficult to bring to a
Yes.
conclusion where you can say, we won and we are going
Yeah.
home now,
Yeah.
right? Which
Yeah.
leads me to the question from our friend Paramu. who says,
Yeah.
how is it that Iran's command structure remained resilient even though some of its top leaders have been unalived? Okay, I think you've already answered that
Yeah.
based
Yeah.
on your, you know, topic of.
Yeah. I think the answer is the Iranians are smarter than they look.
Not only that, it's the
Just kidding. Just kidding.
the
Yeah.
the anti-fragile nature
Yeah.
of the
Yeah.
distributed
Yeah.
system.
Yeah.
Okay. Then Gopal again, the Gulf-based NRI workforce is now returned to India. If they do not go back due to security concerns and are unable to do so, how will it affect remittance to India and eventually growth? First of all, let me just answer Gopal. I don't
Mhm.
think the Gulf-based NRI workforce has returned to India. They're all there.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
I think maybe 3 or 4 people have unfortunately been killed, but there's no
Yeah. Yeah.
exodus of people from the Middle East. Yes, if
Yeah.
they all came back, remittances would be hurt, but I don't think that is the situation. So let me move on to the next question. Dr. Subramanian says, is there a hidden agenda which you think is not being revealed? Well, if it's hidden, then how would you know,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So,
Unless you have, unless one is privy to
some,
inner circles,
right.
right?
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
there
And
probably are hidden agendas, but,
sure,
there's a
but
narrative
they're
war
hidden.
out there.
Yeah. They're hidden. What are you going to do?
Right. Pradeep Kumar says, will the LNG or petroleum disruption will affect the US from where they're getting their supplies? Well, nobody's getting supplies from the US. They're all getting it from the Middle East. China and other suppliers of micro or nanotechnology suppliers to US are getting disturbed by the gas or petroleum supplies. So will it not impact directly or indirectly the supplier economy of the US? Question is not very clear, so let's just move on. Yeah, I don't understand what he's trying to say here. Okay, Mr. Karmachandran says, what is the game plan of China and Russia? Why are they not bothered? Okay, that's a good question.
Well, I think that we can only guess, but I would say that if I were China or Russia, I wouldn't be getting involved either because this is a mess, and I think they see their adversary, the United States, as jumping into probably a quagmire, which is going to be very expensive and
Right.
deplete the U.S. military capabilities. So, they're just kind of buying popcorn and watching the fun.
Well, as Napoleon said, do not interrupt the
Yeah,
enemy when
when
he's
he's
making a
making a
mistake,
mistake.
right?
Yep,
So
yep.
yeah, as far as China and
I think that's their view. Yeah.
yeah, Gopal says, what is the link between the current Gulf War and anti-Semitism?
Oh goodness, that could be a very long
On
answer.
topic.
But yeah, but I very briefly, the uh, enmity or hostility between Jews and Muslims, and to a different extent, Jews and Christians, is very ancient. It's very ancient and very deep seated. And we had uh, a period of several decades where it's been papered over and things were moving, kind of smoothly. But the underlying tensions have always been there.
Right.
So you know, yeah,
Yeah, it's unfortunate, but Jews have had a hard time both against Christians and against Muslims. So I don't know if this war is really connected to it, except insofar as you mentioned a little while ago, Israel has been getting these death
yeah,
threats from Iran for a long time, right?
yeah,
Death to
yeah, yeah,
Israel, we're going to
yeah,
nuke Israel, etc. So maybe
yep, yep,
there's an element of that there.
yeah, yeah. The famous remark of Israel is a one-bomb country.
Yeah, yeah, right.
That's what the Iranian and one of the Iranian presidents, I think, had
Did
said.
say, right.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, next question. This is from Paramu again. Bapa, you talked about drone utilization as a new war strategy. Do you think Iran's horizontal escalation strategy, attacking many countries that are not even in the coalition, a new approach? So he's saying they're escalating it to neighboring
Right.
countries.
Yeah. So I kind of uh, touched on that a little bit when I said, this is a different kind of war where, a country normally would be wary of expanding the war zone, opening up new fronts and involving other countries and so forth. I mean, they would think like a million times before doing anything like that. But in this war, the expansion and the escalation, the horizontal escalation is the strategy.
And partly because,
Because
if I may, partly because the Gulf Cooperation
Mhm.
Council countries are highly vulnerable. They
That's
are
right. Yeah,
tiny
yeah,
little principalities which have nothing but oil.
yeah,
And once you deny them food and especially water,
yeah, yeah.
right, they're pretty much sitting ducks. So
hmm
that may be part of the rationale there.
Yeah, and keep in mind, Rajiv, well, and Parmu, keep in mind that a lot of this has to do with really damaging the credibility of the United States as a
Guarantor,
military guarantor and protector.
right.
So there is a definite logic to it.
Now, a question from Sridhar, who is the president of IITMAA.
Yeah.
Is a Venezuela type transition in Iran still possible? Does this need ground action?
Uh, to the extent that I know and I can say I doubt it sincerely. But
Yeah,
and yeah, anything is possible. But I think Iran is a much harder, resilient target. And as I mentioned, in spite of all their problems of very deep-seated corruption and social tensions and what I would call really violent mismanagement of their social issues, they've managed to actually build up a fairly decent military industrial system and infrastructure. Yes, it's owned largely by the IRGC, and a lot of the money is going into the pockets of the bigwigs. But still, those things are functional. They're churning out military hardware, drones, and so forth. So uh, and they have fairly functional organizational capacity, which as the past 3 weeks have demonstrated, very intense bombardment hasn't managed to kill off.
right.
Yeah.
And let me answer it in a slightly different way. See, there is a famous resource curse where countries that
Yeah.
have a particular
Yeah.
resource
hmm
depend on it to such an extent that everything else atrophies. So, for
Yeah.
example, Nigeria
Yeah.
or Venezuela, where there's no industry, no agriculture, because it's much easier to just dig a hole in the ground and extract
hmm
oil. Now,
Yeah.
Iran
Yeah.
hasn't quite done that, right? They're
Yeah.
very
Yeah.
competent, as you said.
Yeah.
Even their nuclear
hmm
proliferation activity is
Yeah.
homegrown, and
Yep.
this,
Yeah.
this whole Shahid business, right?
hmm
And the fact that
Yeah. Yeah.
they're also running around creating a whole bunch of partners, right? The Houthis, the
hmm
Hezbollah,
Yeah. Yeah.
and so on, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
they have significant regional influence, which has diminished
hmm
quite a bit lately.
Yeah.
So I think it's not gonna be an easy cakewalk for anybody. And the
Yeah.
other
Yeah.
fact is, if you look at Iran physically, it's more than half the size of continental India,
hmm
peninsular India. It's huge, and
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
mountainous,
hmm
and it has this Strait of Straits of Hormuz as a choke
Yeah.
point.
Yeah.
So it's whereas Venezuela had none of the above, right? It's like a
Yeah.
sitting duck. So yeah, I think it's not going to be that easy, Sridhar.
Yeah. I think compared to Iran, Venezuela was just
Piece of
shockingly
cake.
misgoverned. Yeah.
Yeah,
Just shockingly misgoverned.
right.
Yeah.
Next question from Hirumani Nath. How do you think the current situation will affect Indian financial markets in the short term and the long term? Long term. What do you think?
I think l- you know you're in a better position to address that. But as as much as I know about financial markets, in the short term, there will be some significant impact if it goes on for a long time, and God forbid something very drastic happens, like a cyber attack or an EMP attack or something like that. Then we are looking at a period of instability. So instability is more dangerous than markets just taking a hit of 10% or whatever. Yeah.
Let me address that by saying that, yeah, I agree with you. In the short term, things are messed up, and this is obvious, right? The markets have
Yeah.
collapsed quite a bit. Now, there is a medium term problem, which is de-dollarization. As
Mm-hmm.
the dollar, I think it's likely to become less significant, and the U.S. economy is going to probably not grow as much as expected. Now, that has a medium-term impact on India because India is also a significant, America is a significant trading partner for
Yeah.
India. But in the long run, and many economists and so on have talked about long India, where
Mm-hmm.
we had this Goldilocks moment at least
Yeah.
last
Yeah.
year, where
Yeah.
India was experiencing low inflation and pretty reasonable growth. So I
Mm-hmm.
think that trajectory, especially because as the populace becomes more and more of a consuming populace and more
Yeah.
demanding, I think things are going to look reasonably good for India. So I think the war, if, as you said, unless something catastrophic happens, the war is going to be a blip. It's not going to make a huge difference. It'll probably reduce India's growth by a percentage or two, and inflation,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
was
Yeah.
about 2% last year, will probably go up to 5-6%. But
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
manageable. Again,
Yeah.
anchored by
Yeah.
the
100%. Yeah.
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 Next question
Mm.
is from Atul Singh. It says, regarding war strategy, Iran is using cheap Shahid drones to exhaust
Mm.
expensive interceptors of US, Israel, West Asia. What are the
Yeah.
lessons for India to learn? Uh, like India also uses expensive S-400 interceptors. What can
Mm-hmm.
India do to avoid such things vis-a-vis Pakistan?
Build interceptor drones. Lot
Yeah,
of them.
I agree with you. Start building drones
Yeah.
left, right, and center,
Yeah.
and repurpose them. I mean, drones may
Yeah.
not be the complete answer to
Yeah.
this
Yeah.
situation, but they can do an enormous amount of damage
Yeah.
until
Yeah.
and unless somebody invents beam weapons.
Yeah. Yeah.
Electromagnetic pulses and
Mm-hmm.
directed energy
Laser.
beams.
Yeah. Or
Yeah,
laser. Yeah.
which they're doing that. But at the moment,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think a swarm of especially
Mm.
self-contained drones,
Yeah.
AI-based drones, are
Yeah.
likely to be very difficult to defend
Yeah.
against. So I think India should invest more in that. And of course, in our missile system,
Yeah. Yeah.
BrahMos is being sold all over the place to
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Indonesia, the Philippines, etc. So I think we have an
Yeah. Yeah.
opportunity there.
Yeah. Yeah. So while I was waiting for the for this chat,
Yeah.
I just saw an interesting news item, which is that Ukraine has uh, actually mastered the uh, art of manufacturing defensive drones cheaply and in bulk, and also it's been gathering vast amounts of data from its drone expeditions, and now there's an effort on to try and get that from Ukraine to try to train the AI systems.
Right.
So that's another dimension, and these
Data.
are
Yeah.
yeah, so these are mostly, brain power driven, uh, driven steps,
Military.
and India can easily do it. The
Right.
brain power is there.
Right.
So yeah.
Here's the final question. This is from Lakshmi, who says, Bapa saw a report that Russia is angling towards asking the US to stop supporting Ukraine in
Hmm.
response to US asking it to stop providing intel to Iran. Could this be true or just propaganda? If true, how will this affect the trajectory of the war?
Yeah, so I too saw something to that effect, which is, you stop helping Ukraine with intel, and we'll stop helping Iran with intel, and your guess is as good as mine about how true that is, because this is wartime, and there are any number of planted stories and trial balloons and whatever things people do to try and shift public perception and influence matters. So
Right. Now, let
it's
me
possible. Yeah.
let me address that too, because I think everybody's beginning to realize that alienating Russia is not really the best answer for Western Europe
Mm,
and the US. So they need an off ramp too, and in that
mm,
sense, I'm sorry to say this: Ukraine may be dispensable.
mm,
People may not really care about Ukraine that much. So I suspect that there will be some kind of a rapprochement between the US and the Soviets, or not Soviets, I mean the Russians going forward,
Yeah.
which is a good thing because we see this is a war. It's a white people's war, which India has
Sure.
no dog in. You know that fight is
Yeah.
not one we have any dog in, and it's just bothering us. So the sooner they stop that, the better that would be. So
Sure.
because I think for both these countries, the Russians and the Americans, in the long run, their chief enemy is China, and the
Yeah.
sooner they stop, building up China, especially Russia is now forced into China's arms, the better for
Yeah.
all of them concerned.
Yeah, I think in the near term at least, it's not bad for India to have some kind of engagement with Ukraine, if only to prevent the drones from proliferating into India and into terrorist hands,
Yeah,
and possibly to even try to leverage their expertise in drone warfare,
right,
and accelerate India's own drone program.
right. Good. I think we've fresh run out of questions, and we run out of time too. We're 10 minutes,
Okay.
12 minutes over. So, Baparao, thank you very much for taking the time to address these questions, especially from an American perspective, with a great deal of concern about what happens in India. So, thank you for participating in this, and maybe some other time we'll have you back for another interesting conversation. And I'm seeing a lot of positive
Absolutely.
messages coming up. Okay,
Yeah.
so
I enjoyed our time together, and thank you for making it happen. You and all the alumni association folks.
great.
Thank you. And yeah, it's a pleasure to meet the ones that I had a chance to meet. Before the talk started. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay then.
Yeah.
Thank
So
you.
let's do it again. Yeah.
We'll do it. We'll do it again.
Okay.